for that reason. Alrighty, here we are one more time, and we're starting. We began last time Recollections of Things to Come by Elena Garro, and now we're going to get into it a little bit more deeply. We saw the historical context last time, and of course you should look more into that yourselves. If you're interested, all you have to do is put Cristero Rebellion into Google, and you'll find plenty of material on it. We looked at some of the places in the novel where the main players are referred to. Madero, of course, the Mexican revolutionary, Zapata, Angeles, Pancho Villa, Francisco Villa. We looked at a reference to Calles. There are a lot more. And so you'll have noticed those as you go along, I hope. Let's say that we have this kind of, well, we do have the historical, rather specific historical backdrop, which we've now talked about, religious conflict, a kind of counter-revolution to the Mexican Revolution. And then what we have in the foreground is all this mythic, magical stuff. We have characters that disappear into thin air. We have a narrator who is the land itself. We have almost page by page references to the timelessness of the place. So this is one of those novels that I really do have to call magical realism. I don't have any hesitation there, because the conventions of realism are defied so many times that we have to notice. I'm particularly interested, and I'm going to talk more at length next time with you and show you some images of the Mesoamerican Codices. Elena Garro knew very well the indigenous heritage of Mexico. And one of the things that remains, despite the destruction of European colonization, are texts called codices. They're the painted books that the Nahua and Maya peoples wrote with images before the arrival of the Europeans, and thus the arrival of the alphabet. And there's a time-space, it's one word or with a slash between time-space, conception that is very different in indigenous cultures. We've already seen it, we just did with the storyteller, the idea that, you know, time is continuous and progress and linear and all of that goes by the by with the storytellers in the Machiguenga group, and here too there's a substratum of indigenous culture. So I'll talk to you about that next time. But here I think let's just start by sorting out the plot. Could somebody just do that for us if you had to say, you know, in 3 minutes how this plot unfolds? Could someone do that for us just to help us out? Who's got that? It's simple. It's a pretty simple plot, really. Let's see. Amanda, you love this novel. Yay, Amanda loves this novel. So she'll do it for us. Would you please, Amanda?
It's the story of Rosas, Francisco Rosas. He's the military leader. He comes to the town with a mistress called Julia. She leaves him with the stranger, Felipe Botardo. And then you kind of get introduced also to the Moncada family, which is Isabel, Nicholas, and Juan, and their mother and their father.
This is the Moncadas. I've got this family diagram on our blackboard, so that's good. I'm glad you're doing it, because it's partly a family saga, really.
Yeah, they all kind of look at Julia, and she's something different, but that's not really what the story's about. Julia leaves, Rosas becomes even more dictatorial, and then they hide a priest from the military people, because they start to go in and, you know, attack the churches and everything. And they hold a big fiesta in order to get the priest out of the town undercover. But Rosas is onto them. He makes them stay there all overnight. He captures the priest. He captures one of the prostitutes, Lucia, and El Presidente, the leader of the prostitutes. And he kills all the people involved. Isabella becomes his mistress. She begs him for Nicholas's life. Juan dies. And he says, okay, he's gonna give Isabella her brother. But her brother offers himself up and is shot anyway, even though somebody else is shot in his place. And Francisco Rosas can't deal with Isabella. She smothers him, even though she's his mistress. She smothers him and he can't bear to touch her. And he runs away from her the same way that Julia kind of ran away from him. And that's how it ends, and Isabella goes on and becomes a stone because she loves Rosas and she chooses him.
And she's ostracized from her community.
She is, yes.
She takes sides with this dictator who's come in to strong-arm the town.
Yeah, she loves him.
Yeah.
Which is tragic, and in a way, you know, he loves Julia and it's tragic, and she loves him and it's tragic, so it doesn't end well at all.
Yes, right, yeah. And of course it doesn't begin well, we could say as well, because we know from the beginning that this town is already dead. And it's this kind of mythic voice. I hope in your discussion of the narrative technique that you notice that this is a rather unusual narrator. The land, it's the stone promontory on which the town sat. And so there's this kind of nostalgia, really this, almost you can cut it with a knife, looking back at when the town was alive from the perspective of a town that's dead and everyone in it is dead. It's a bit like Pedro Páramo in that way. You would know Lisa Pedro Páramo. And so there are towns that are told by a kind of mythic voice after it's all over, and that's one of these. What Amanda was saying about Julia and Isabel needs to be discussed. First, Scott, if you could show this family tree that I put up on our board. There are two main families, so there are plenty of other characters, but since there's so many M's, names beginning with M, I just thought I would do this. Of course, Martin and Ana Moncada are the main ones, and they're the parents of Juan, Nicolas, and Isabel, as Amanda told us. And then there are the Melendezes, Matilde and Joaquim Melendez, or Joaquin, I guess I should say. It's not Joaquim in Spanish, Joaquin Melendez. And they have, Martin and Matilde are brother and sister. So their children are cousins. It's not so important, but I found myself, as I was reading this novel the first time, wanting to sketch out a kind of family tree, at least of these two families that are related. There are, as you know, Elvira and Conchita Montúfar, yet another M name, but they aren't related, and so we're going to leave them to one side. But so everybody got that. It's, you know, you will have noticed that, and the connections are quite important in the sense that Martin and Matilde have different positions on the political events unfolding under their noses. We looked at some of that last time. Martin is the liberal in the crowd, and other people are not. But so we have these characters, we have these families living in this village. We know they're dead now. The novel comes back around to the beginning, and we have Isabel made into a stone. This is magical realism. Real people aren't made into stones in my world, but in the novel's world they are. And we see, why don't we just go to the end of the novel and look at that? And it's possible, I think, to say, oh, so it's Isabel who's the narrator of this novel. Because at the beginning we're told that it is a stone, and it seems to me a female voice. It's not identified as such that I remember, but we could sort of say this stone business has something to do with Isabel. Look at the very final chapter of part 2, 16. It's page 288 in my volume, and I hope in all of yours. 288, right? The weeks and months passed, and like Juan Carino, we never became our old selves again. That we and I that is perennial throughout this novel. It's the narrative voice of the community now dead. It's impossible, right? But so is an omniscient narrator. That's an impossible thing too. So then with the novel, but here with this voice, let's say that it represents the collective history of Ixtapec, this town. And like Juan Carino, we never became our old selves again. Francisco Rosas always stopped being what he was, also stopped being what he was. Drunken and unshaven, he no longer searched for anybody. One afternoon, he went away on a troop train with his soldiers and aides, and we never heard from him again. Other officers came to give land to Rodolfito, the bad guy, right? And to repeat the hangings in a different silence in the branches of the same tree. But no one ever again invented a fiesta to redeem men from execution. That plot detail that we were talking about earlier. The village puts together a party in order to sneak the priest out of town. This isn't that much longer. We'll go ahead and read it. There are times when strangers do not understand my fatigue or my dust. The towns. Because now there is no one to mention the name of the Moncadas. The stone, the memory of my suffering, and the end of the fiesta of Carmen B. de Arrieta are here. Gregoria put this inscription on it. Her words are burned out fireworks. I am Isabel Moncada, the daughter of Martin Moncada and Ana Cuetara de Moncada, born in the town of Ixtapec on December 1st, 1907. I turned into stone on October 5th, 1927, before the startled eyes of Gregoria Juarez. This is what's written on the gravestone, if you want, or written on the stone that Isabel has become. It's not just a gravestone. I caused the unhappiness of my parents and the death of my brothers Juan and Nicolas. When I came to ask the Virgin to cure me of my love for General Francisco Rosas, who killed my brothers, I repented and preferred the love of the man who ruined me and ruined my family. Here I shall be, alone with my love, as a memory of the future, forever and ever. So this memory of the future, recuerdo del porvenir, recollections of things to come, as it's translated. I think it's a mistake. It's the same phrase, memory of the future. Los recuerdos del porvenir in Spanish, memory of the future. I wish they'd just said memories of the future. It would be better than recollections of things to come, especially when they've translated the same phrase here as memory of the future. In any case, that's the end of the novel. We get this Sisyphusian figure pushing the rock up the hill in the engravings that University of Texas Press saw fit to add to this book. Those wouldn't have had to do those engravings with Garro. But okay, so we have this stone that ends the novel. Let's look at the one that begins it. And as I said, it's possible, I think, to read Isabel as the narrator. I prefer not to. I prefer to read the novel as a kind of mythic voice that echoes, as in a place that's been deserted for a long time. And we are told again and again that this is dusty and there used to be people in my streets and all of this stuff. So there's that rock, the picture, chapter 1, the very beginning, part 1, chapter 1. And it's rather beautifully done, and I think it's rather beautifully translated too. We'll take a look at it together. We'll just read the first paragraph or maybe two. Here I sit on what looks like a stone. Only my memory knows what it holds. I see it and I remember, and as water flows into water, so I melancholically come to find myself in its image, covered with dust, surrounded by grass, self-contained and condemned to memory and its variegated mirror. You see, it's a stone, it's also a city, it's also, or a town anyway, it's also a collective voice for the people in that town. And maybe it's Julia, though, as I say, I prefer to think of it as a collective voice. I see it, I see myself, and I am transfigured into a multitude of colors and times. I am and I was in the colors and times I am and I was in many eyes. I am only memory and the memory that one has of me. Okay, so the town is gone, but that doesn't mean that you can't remember back and have colors and times and so forth. From this height I contemplate myself, vast, lying in a dry valley. I am surrounded by spiny mountains and yellow plains inhabited by coyotes, I should say. My houses are squat, white painted, and their roofs appear to be sun-baked or water shimmering, depending on whether it is the dry or the rainy season. There are days like today when remembering makes me sad. I wish I had no memory, or that I could change myself into pious dust to escape the penalty of seeing myself. Okay, so we're not going to have to go through a lot. I have a long list of places where this I or we narrator, this collective voice, comes into the text in ways that are really quite idiosyncratic and quite beautiful. Are there things that you want to point out about this narrator? Yeah, Karsna, would you push your little button, please? Thank you.
Okay, I guess I was kind of not confused, but kind of trying to make it something into what I wanted to be as I was reading the book. Because when I first read the book, you start at the beginning, you see the stone, and then you would think of it as a kind of a mythic voice, as it. But then as I kept reading, and then you get to the end, and she talks about how I'm Isabel, I'm the stone. I'm thinking, okay, well maybe the narrator is Isabel.
Yeah.
But then I was thinking, okay, well, it can be both, but at times when she'd say I think Isabel, and at times when it would say we, I think, okay, is the stone a representative of everybody in the town? And I just didn't know. And so I guess it was confusing. I just went ahead and put on the quiz that it was Isabel, because I guess that's just what made more logical sense to me. But then I guess if it's magical realism, it doesn't necessarily have to make logical sense.
Well, there's plenty of magic here, but I guess, you know, it's fine with me that you put that on the quiz. It shows me you have read to the end of the novel, which is what the quiz is for. That's good. But it's also maybe that we don't have to decide, and I stand up here and say I prefer one way to the other because of the we, which is complicated. And then this whole perspectival play here. I think there's... And because Garro is so beautifully about the land, she's constantly giving us a sense of this kind of open and yet almost mountainous. You can see that too in different ways, of this town that no longer exists, the white, squat, white painted roofs and sun-baked and water shimmering and all of that. So I don't think you're wrong at all in saying that it's Julia. For me, it's harder to make that square with all that all that kind of mythic perspective. But either way, or both ways, let's say it's both ways for now, or that it somehow works, it can't be an accident that Garro ends up and makes this principal figure into a stone. And so clearly she wants that to resonate there. But one thing about magical realism that's nice is we don't always have to make a decision. We can let it kind of float, and sometimes it feels this way and sometimes it feels that way. And that's what Garro's doing, I think, is she's wanting to subvert our certainty about the narrative voice. So yeah, that strikes me that you're right to sort of toss both up and think about them, and then if you come down on one side or the other, that's also okay with me, and okay with Garro, it seems to me too. Other comments about the narrative structure? Yeah, Lisa, would you comment?
I kept kind of noting some passages that would recur talking about ants, and I have them marked here. But I thought that for me, and it's not fair, I guess, that I keep bringing it up because it's not a part of our class. But the Rulfo novel, Pedro Paramo, is told, you find out at the end, sort of by a bunch of souls who are dead, and the town is a ghost town and they're all dead. And for me, this was so much the same. It's, instead of being told by the sort of specifically sort of by the souls of the dead, it's being told by an omniscient narrator of the memories of the dead, and it's sort of the same thing. And there's a passage, I have 2 or 3 of them marked, but one of them I thought just sort of started it out on or it's not the first one, but it really goes there on 201.
201, let us go there real quick.
And it's the first complete paragraph, and this starting with the second sentence. They're talking about Martin Moncada, and he says, he had entered the subterranean world of the ants, complicated by minuscule tunnels where there was not even room for a thought and where memory was layers of earth and root and trees. It just, I mean, he's dead. He's a body.
That's very nice, yeah.
And there were previously some, there's one on 156 that's talking about the ticking of the clock represents or is punctual as an ant moving along a piece of furniture. There's another one on
what page was the one about that you just said?
The ant, 156.
156. Okay, I haven't noticed the ant complex here, so that's good.
I just thought it was interesting. And then on 258, he calls the ants the Franciscos, and they said
which page? Sorry.
258.
Okay.
And he said, hold on. the Franciscos are thieves, and on that afternoon the three laughed, hearing Nicholas baptize the ants with the general's first name. They had talked about ants previously, I think, on that same page, but that's the one where it kind of got... Here we go. Pensively, they threw little stones at the narrow columns of ants that hurried by, carrying the leaves they stole from the acacias in the gardens.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sounds like death.
Right. And I had one mark, now I'm not finding it, where there's discussion of the ground and being underground. The novel to which Lisa's referred, and I think maybe we've referred to it earlier here, is one of the most brilliant of Mexican novels, and I should teach it with this one, and in the past I have taught it with this one, because it's, as Lisa just said, it's the same kind of, I call it animate earth novel. It's like the ground is the ground, but it's got voices and echoes, and you hear the past just kind of seeping up to the surface. It's really a very beautiful thing. That other novel is called Pedro Páramo, P-A-R-A-M-O. It's the name of a man who's the General Rosas figure, in fact, in this little old town called Comala. Garro learned a great deal from that novel. That novel, Pedro Páramo, by Juan Rulfo, R-U-L-F-O. It's also got little scenes like this one from the Revolution, the Mexican Revolution. Jaime, you with your interest in the Zapatistas would be very interested in Pedro Páramo. So I actually sometimes have taught in the past the third novel with this, another animate earth novel, which is As I Lay Dying. Oh, no, I'm wrong. It's The House of Breath by William Goyen, which also, it's a Texas novel. William Goyen actually lived in Houston, grew up in Trinity, Texas, and he creates in them one of the most beautiful novels. It's one of my favorites in the world, along with all of the others, of course, it's The House of Breath. Very pretty. So if you like this kind of novel, Amanda has left, but we need to remind her to read these when she has time, because they're all they're just weighted with nostalgia, going back, but you can't quite return, and so forth. So thank you for those references to ants. That's another animate earth issue here, I think, showing that all is dead and gone. Now, and then I think, Sarah, you had something about the narrative structure as well. Could you tell us?
I was going to respond to what you said about maybe it's Isabel. I was thinking it's more like she takes the place of Julia,
Yeah.
her position. So I think Julia is more of like she dictates so much what the general does, and the whole state of the town is dictated by her and his mood with her. And
Yeah.
so, and magical realism is like very symbolic, right? So Isabel is it's kind of more like a symbol. So I want to say also on page 263 at the bottom.
263 at the bottom. Let us get there. Let's see. 263. Yeah.
It says the years come and the years go, and I expect still wait. So it's like saying right there that
Okay, thank
it's
you.
the town.
Yeah, there it's very specifically defined as the town. Yeah. But let me go back to your comment about Isabel. We're told that early on that there are two Isabels, right? And she's a kind of problematic figure. We can look at that passage, but then at the end, at least when she falls in love with Rosas and decides to throw caution to the wind, sacrificing her family for her love and so forth, that she's not exactly divided at all. She seems to be a kind of traitor and so forth. How do you see her as symbolic, and of what, Isabel?
Well, the people started to become afraid of her in the same way that they were afraid of Julia. They feared her, and they loved her at first, and then they feared her when she went to be with him.
Yeah.
And I didn't see it though that she loved him. I thought that she really had no choice. Like she got pushed into it, and then she couldn't get out of it because of what he had done, and all the people hated her because she went with him while he attacked her family and was killing off her family members, and she really had nowhere to go after that. At the end, Gregorio says, you can't go to the hotel. There's no place for you.
That's right. Okay, thank you. That's a good point too. It's not that she was utterly free to make the choices that she made, or the choice that she made. There's one feminist critic. The reason I asked you, and because these two characters, Julia and Isabel, are kind of mirror images, aren't they? You have to see it that way. Both of them have a relation to Rosas, and it's the opposite relation. One, Julia, is the mythic beloved who's beyond the reach of Rosas, and Isabel seems to be a bit the opposite, wishing that Rosas would pay attention to her, or chasing after Rosas, but he becomes unattainable to her. There's a woman named Jean Franco who has a book on novels by and about women in Mexico called Plotting Women, Plotting Women, Women. And she does this reading of Julia and Isabel as the kind of thing we've just said, a kind of mirror images of each other. But what she says is that she critiques this novel as not a feminist novel because, or at least failing to represent women as selves, because both of these main characters are defined by Rosas, and both are, as she says, outside of history. Julia is a kind of mythic person. She disappears into thin air, as we know. She becomes a legend. She becomes a myth. She might as well be the Virgin of Guadalupe. She's not a real flesh and blood woman who is getting her doctorate in literature or something like that. In other words, she's a kind of idea in the minds of men. And then comes Isabel, who is equally unreal, according to Jean Franco, this argument, in that she somehow remains outside of history too. She's petrified at the end, so that we don't see any women here who are agents, who are da-da-da. I mean, if you're interested in that kind of feminist critique, I can give you a little more information about that, because Garro has been read in terms of feminist ideas. But anyway, both of those characters, from Jean Franco's point of view, are somehow subsumed by patriarchy, let's say, that they're not allowed. But you can say, well, who isn't subsumed by patriarchy? We see what General Rosas becomes, a kind of drunkard there, doing nothing in particular. But anyway, because those two women are, and because you said they're symbolic, it occurred to me to go, mention this particular reading of these characters. I mean, we can say that all literary characters, if it's a good work of novel, have importance beyond themselves. That we read them and we say, oh, isn't that a beautiful character? Oh, isn't that a funny character? We get something out of it other than there's always some significance to the character, depending upon the novel. But somehow we take, for example, take the Saul figure in the novel we've just finished. What does he represent? Well, he represents a particular attitude toward indigenous cultures. And we talked about him in those terms, beyond being a particular self. So I guess when you think about characters in novels, you might want to think about how they operate on a scale beyond just their singular selves. Other comments about the narrative technique? Why do you think she does this? I'm going to ask you the same question I asked about the frame narration in The Storyteller. Why? What is the effect on the reader that couldn't have been gotten if she had just narrated this without that I narrator? She could easily have told, Garro could have decided that this was an omniscient retrospective narrative telling about the town and what happened and so forth. Yeah, Jenny.
Well, I think that when you have an I narrator, there comes with that a certain judgment and a certain perspective that only that I narrator has. And so you don't necessarily get the full picture or a non-biased kind of outlook of events. And so I think that when you use an omniscient narrator like she does, whether it be the town or the stone or whatever, it gives it you get the full effect, and you don't get judgment with the story, I don't think. And I think it's told the way it was without judgment.
What you're pointing out is quite true, that this is someplace in between a first-person narrator and an omniscient narrator, because we have the general perspective, It's not like, because usually an I narrator is one of the characters in the novel who says, look, I'm going to tell you what happened to me yesterday, and then I walked out of my front door and so forth. And so you get the perspective of that single character. And lots of times, first-person narrators, in fact, we should say always, are partial and often unreliable, because you can't tell if a first-person narrator is telling you the truth. He's telling you, or she's telling you within the novel, what he or she knows.
And I think you also, like, in this novel, there's a lot that if it was an I narrator and if it was a character in the novel, you wouldn't get.
No, we couldn't. Yeah, that's
you
right.
couldn't. I mean, this person, there are things that are happening, everywhere at one time, and there's no way that you could get the full effect
Sure, yeah.
of the story.
Yeah, because a first-person narrative, if the character exists in the novel, can only know what a character in that room, sitting in a given room, is happening at that point. Yeah, Karsna, were you going to say something?
Again, this is why I was torn between who I thought was the narrator. It actually kind of irritated me after a while because I couldn't figure it out. Well, that's just how I felt. But I think that, when I listed out my chart of who I thought would be the narrator, one of my thoughts for the stone and the lamb being the narrator was because if she wanted to represent it as a collective memory, because when you say I, it's not a collective memory, it's just what that one person recalls. And so I thought, in order for her to make the effect that she wanted to tell us that, okay, this is what happened to this town, this is not what happened to this person or this family, this is what happened to this town. So I think that's why she was trying, well, I'm going to say try, I think that's why she did make the narrator the land, so it could be kind of a collective memory, because like she said, if all these things were going on at one time, Isabel couldn't have possibly been all these places at one time, and she possibly couldn't have known. So
no, I think this collective voice thing is really important. Remember, I pointed out when we were reading Garcia Marquez, both novels, that every once in a while you'll have a we and you'll have a here instead of there. It's here. And you're reminded that this is something like the same kind of thing. Of course, here it's on every page. In Garcia Marquez, every once in a while it slips in. But if you don't learn anything else from an English class, and I know many of you are taking this for history credit, but this is both, I hope. But in an English class, you will always pay attention to narrative technique, because if you don't do that, then you might as well say, well, reading a novel is the same as reading the newspaper. Everything written has a point of view. In the newspaper, we take it as a kind of general voice, reporting what happened yesterday in Pakistan. And if we read the New York Times or we read the Chronicle, we have a certain expectation of objectivity, even though we know that that's just an expectation at times. But in a novel, this is all constructed very carefully as a work of art, so we have to think about its effect. Other comments about this retrospective filtering of memory? Yeah, Lisa?
I like the earlier comment here with Julia, kind of combining Julia and Isabel.
Yeah.
What I think it's the narrator is both. The stone is the town, and it's Isabel. But I think in the beginning, when it's more the stone, they make some references on that. I can't pull them out that quick. But about the town is recalling and saying very directly, Julia is the center of the town. Julia is the center of our attention.
Yeah.
And so I think that narrative technique kind of just brings it full circle, because Julia is the center of a town. Isabel replaces Julia, so Isabel becomes the center of a town, and and then Isabel becomes the narrator. So it's sort of
Yeah, it does.
It sort of gives it a timelessness and a cycle that does something about that recollection.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. Did you have a comment, Melissa, back there?
It's basically been said, but yes, that if the narrator was completely omniscient, then we wouldn't have gotten the close view from all the characters that we did get.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
The only thing that did bother me is that if the town was really the narrator, then it wouldn't have called itself Ixtepec, but it did. You know what I mean? If the narrator was the town itself, then it would have never mentioned what its name was, unless it said Ixtepec.
Well, it could be, but actually that I think is only the one place, as I recall, where it actually calls itself by its name. But it's the town, it's also that rock, it's that land. It's somehow, we have to think of what myth and mythic narrative might be. Yeah, Eli?
Well, one thing that's bothering me right now is if it is the rock and the rock is Isabel, how do we get an unbiased account of what happened. I mean,
Well, maybe you're willing to disagree with Jenny and say that it's not unbiased.
I do agree on
You think it's
what I've
unbiased?
heard. Yeah, but it's just kind of weird how he pulls that off.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's weird. It's really one of the only novels I can think of where it is a first person, whether plural or singular, I or we. It's a first person narrative that also attempts to be omniscient and gives us this stuff that I couldn't know. So that's kind of why I begin our discussion with that. It seems to me a contradiction in part in terms. I don't think this is an unbiased novel, actually, but Jenny, you go ahead and say what you're going to say.
I was just going to say that as the narrator is one narrator, it's also like a collection of things
Yeah.
that make it one.
Yeah, sure.
You
So
know.
it's the parts that make up the whole, if you want, that we get, yeah. I was going to say, I don't think it's politically the novel isn't unbiased in the sense that General Rosas is portrayed as a horrible guy. I mean, in part, this is a dictator novel. We've seen another dictator novel, or sort of one, which is The General in His Labyrinth. It's not quite a dictator novel, but you know that subgenre in Latin American fiction. Many writers have written dictator novels, including Garcia Marquez, not just the Labyrinth, The General in His Labyrinth, but also one called The Autumn of the Patriarch, which is his dictator novel. And Garcia Marquez, Vargas Llosa has his about Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. It came out about 4 years ago, called the Fiesta of the Goat, Fiesta del Chivo, about Trujillo, who was horrible. I got tired of reading that novel because I got tired of rapes and humiliations and all sorts of other grosserias, but he does a very good job of doing a dictator novel. In a way, this is a dictator novel too. Clearly, the narrator and the author have a position to take on the politics of that are described here. Yeah, Ron?
Could it be perhaps that Garro was just trying to emphasize the tragedy of the story, not just this town, but of all of Mexico at this
Oh, yeah.
time? And
Yeah.
perhaps maybe if she narrated any other way, she couldn't accomplish that. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. I think, this is a very, as Amanda said earlier, it doesn't end well. This is a very bittersweet, it's bittersweet because it's so beautifully done. But this is a very tragic tale. And, whether this kind of collective I, narrator, collective I, that makes no sense, but there it is, that's what it is, a collective first-person narrator, allows her to do that better, probably so, because there's all this, I won't say whining because it's not whining, but there's all this lament, that's the word, lament for what's happened. We used to be, brightly colored houses. Now there's dust, all this, so it's dust to dust. And I think you're right. I think that personalizing the narrative voice does make the nostalgia more palpable. The nostalgia for how things didn't work out and how they should have, and how there are bullies and how there are mistakes and so forth. So, and what I would say to you about narrative technique too, and this is a generalization, and I think it's a correct one, is whenever you have a personified narrator in a piece of fiction, it's calling attention to the problem of telling the story. In other words, an omniscient narrator says, once upon a time there were 3 wise men, or once upon a time there were 3 little bears and Goldilocks and so forth. You just get right into the story there. Then you're thinking about the 3 little bears or whatever. That's a terrible example. Whereas when you have someone saying, let me tell you how my mother told me that story about the 3 little bears, then you're problematizing the nature of narrative itself. How do you tell the story? Whose version? Well, mine, but it was my mother's before mine, and so forth. So this kind of filtering, I like to call it filtering of memory through the narrative voice, I think affects this novel tremendously. I think it would be less effective otherwise. There are flashes forward to the end. There are lots of flashes backwards. We see the town contemplating itself, and so forth. I'm going to leave that to you. Other comments about the narrative technique? I think it's incredibly successful. I don't like the ending particularly personally. It just seems like, whoops, too quick. I think from the point of view of the verbal surface, as I like to say, that the language and the structuring of the narrative is a great success because it's unique in my experience. And well, the other would be Pedro Páramo, and the third would be The House of Breath by William Goyen, the ones I've mentioned before. But it's not very often that you have a disappeared town that narrates its own story. The House of Breath, it's more of a singular narrator, a young boy who goes back to find this town that's now a ghost town. Very beautiful too. Okay, other comments about the narrative technique? I mean, we can get further into it if we want, but I think maybe that's enough for that. What I'd like to do is look at a few other things. I'm going to leave it to you to notice the descriptions of the land, starting with the rock upon which the narrator sits, or is it that the rock is the narrator, blah, blah. So we're going to do that. I want to look at the dictator aspects of this, and then, as I said, next time I'm going to show you some pictures of the Mesoamerican Codices, those painted books, and look at the time and timelessness and shifting time. But there's one place, 255, where I'd like to go now, where the dictator novel, that Rosas figure, which is really, you know, the terribleness of this novel and the terribleness of history in Latin America in lots of parts, the strong person who then begins to torture the weak people. And indeed, that little engraving at the top of page 254, the beginning of chapter 11, second part, is apropos. But here I'm going to read about 2 or 3 paragraphs because we see the dictator and we also see this business of the theme of time and how time and space are unified. It's very hard for us to think of that because as Westerners we have calendars and we have maps. We have time and we have space. But the indigenous Mesoamerican way was not that. It was to integrate time and space, to think of a kind of living medium. I'll talk to you more about it. It's very hard to think about because we don't think about time and space in those ways. But look at this rather lyrical couple or 3 paragraphs here, 255. I'll just go ahead and read them and comment on them as we go. Where do the dates come from and where do they go? They travel for a whole year and with the precision of an arrow pierce the appointed day, show us a past now present in space, dazzle us and burn out. Okay, what dazzles and burns out? A comet. What is this arrow? An arrow moves through space, but she's talking about dates. She's talking about time. So she's working as hard as she can, and I think successfully, to overcome in this one sentence, and we'll see more of it, the separation of time and space. She's spatializing those dates. She's making the dates into things that exist in space. An arrow, something moving through space like an arrow, something that goes through space like a comet. They, the dates, emerge punctually from an invisible time, and in an instant we recover the fragment of a gesture, the tower of a forgotten city, the words of heroes dissected in books, or the astonishment of the morning of our baptism when they gave us a name, which would be a date, our birth date. To enter the nearby space we have forgotten, we merely have to utter the magic of a number. And what number does she utter? A date. So you see how she's really trying, and when you read this at first you think, oh my goodness, this is kind of overwrought, heavy breathing, as I sometimes say about too poetic the prose. What's she trying to accomplish here? What she's trying to accomplish is to break down the barrier between. So we've done it in the first paragraph. Now she's kind of come at it the other way. She says all you have to do if you want to enter space is utter a number, and then she utters the number of her birthday. In my, oh no, I'm sorry, the number of a date, which is October 1st, will be forever the day when the trial of the guests began. When I say it, I'm no longer sitting on this apparent stone. I also love that, apparent stone. Well, it's not a real stone, I guess. It just looks like a stone. What's this? Anyway, when I say that I'm no longer sitting on this apparent stone, I am below, slowly entering the plaza, following my people who began gathering there very early to learn the fate of the accused. You see how brilliantly we get the narrative discussion of time and space. We're looking at that invisible narrator, or is it the stone, or is it Isabel? And then within about half a sentence, we're moving into the retrospective narrative. She's great at transitions. We'll be contemplating dates and arrows and comets, and then suddenly we're looking at the plaza and those people, and the next sentence takes us down to the story, the realistic story that we're following, the retrospective narrative of these events. The sentencing took place inside the military command, and yet we followed step by step the words and gestures that took place behind closed doors. The general passed us. Now she's one of the townspeople there, this narrator, looking at the treetops. At this moment, I can smell the freshness of his cologne and see his empty glance at leaves and branches. We've just skipped in that sentence from the past, the general passed us, looking at us, and I can smell. She didn't say I could smell. She says I can smell. And I will refer to her as she. Sorry, I just do that. Smell the freshness of his cologne. So we're back and forth. What's going on in these couple of 3 paragraphs is kind of impressive. We remained under his motionless shadow, which motionlessness and timelessness are very frequent here. We remained under his motionless shadow, which repeated the same crime over and over again with the painstaking precision of a maniac. In his immobile time, the trees did not change their leaves. The stars were fixed, the verbs to come and go were the same. In the immobile time, like time stops, right? To come and to go were the same. Francisco Rosa stopped the amorous current that makes and unmakes words and deeds and kept us in his circular hell. The Moncadas had wanted to run away to find the coming and going of the stars and the tides, the luminous time that spins around the sun, the space where distances are within the reach of one hand. They had wanted to escape from the single bloody day of Ixtepec, but Rosas abolished the door that leads us to the memory of space. See how she's mixing stuff around here? Abolishes the door that leads to the memory of space, and rancorously he blamed them for the motionless shadows he heaped upon us. Well, you start to get it. This is really piling a lot of stuff on here. Let's just finish the paragraph. The general only knew of the existence of a few streets, and by dint of his believing in them, they became unreal to him. I can say, wait a minute, what's that? By dint of his believing in them, they became unreal to him, and he only touched them when he pursued the shadows he found on their corners. We paid him for his fixed world with crimes. Okay, so then we get more into the story. It's very, very typical that these chapters will start with a kind of meditation that's metaphysical, if you want, a kind of discussion of time and space, or the narrative perspective being here and there. But right after this, we get back into the action of the narrative. But you see what I'm talking about with this attempt to spatialize time, to make time material, to make it an object that you can look at, that you can feel, that you can measure, literally. So anyway, that's going to be our topic for next time, and we'll see more about that. But I wanted to read that passage because when you're looking at this between now and Thursday, please do keep in mind this space-time, timelessness, spacelessness undercurrent, let's say, that I think is really the cause for the magical realism of this novel. It's less that Julia disappears in a puff of smoke. It's more that we can't quite get our feet on the ground because, first of all, it's this, let's say, dead town being revivified by this breath of narration. That's what the House of Breath is about, that you tell the story and it revivifies the dead town. But here also the time-space aspects that are so unsettling, let's say. Okay, let me just say a couple more things and then I'm going to let you go. I've said that this is a kind of dictator novel, which is a Latin American subgenre. It's also a revolutionary novel, that is a novel about the Mexican Revolution and its aftermath. That's another subgenre in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution has generated lots of novels about the Mexican Revolution. It's kind of, they're famous writers of the Revolution, Martin Luis Guzman and others. And then I would also say that it's a satiric novel about the revolution. It shows how stupid the revolution is, how the people are corrupt, how they're silly. Because there's a lot of kind of comic stuff going on here too, with the president, with the prostitutes and so forth. So there's something satiric. This is one we read in Mexico, I think, Lisa Ibargüengoitia's The Relámpagos de Agosto, The Lightning in August. If you want a hilarious send-up of the mess that the Mexican Revolution was, and how people were running around and not knowing what they were doing, and how the generals became generals just by accident. Read Lightning in August by Jorge Ibargüengoitia is his last name, a good Basque last name, I-B-E-N. Ibargüengoitia, I-B-A-R-G-U-E-N-G-O-I-T-A. I should write that down, but I won't. And then I also think it's a magical realist novel, as I've been saying. So there's plenty going on here in terms of what type of novel this would be. The ones we've read so far, I can't anyway, think up so many categories as that. The Storyteller, it's a novel with, it seems to me, a realistic novel with the interspersed chapters, which are also presented as realistic from a different cultural point of view. The same with The General in His Labyrinth. You can't really say it's magical realist and it's dictator and it's da-da-da. So this one, I think, is kind of defying a lot of categories or fitting kind of into a lot. But with that, I'm going to let you go. And if you English majors would stick around for just a minute, I would appreciate it. That is, those of you taking the course for English credit. I'll give you your evaluations. Thank you very much. See you next time, please.